Okay kids, if you want to talk about games that caught me off guard, Nightmare Reaper is going to the top of the list. Normally when I'm playing a game that I'm doing a video on, I intentionally stay away from watching other videos about said game, nor do I read any other reviews of the game until after I have finished playing the game all the way through, and after I've written my script for the video I'm working on. I don't want to inadvertently crib someone else's thoughts on the game and then incorporate viewpoints or jokes into my own work, because when I sit down to talk about these games, I want it to be purely from my point of view, so you get some straight talk from dad, you know what I'm saying? But holy hot damn kids. The moment I finished playing through Nightmare Reaper, I immediately stopped what I was doing and I went and watched Civi's video that he had just put out so that I could see what kind of random shit he'd gone through while playing it. And then I went and looked up some reviews, which were surprisingly sparse considering that this game has been heavily hyped leading up to the game's departure from Steam Early Access. Because the moment I completed my first playthrough of Nightmare Reaper, I needed to experience what I had just experienced through the perspective of others who had also played through it. Because I not only couldn't believe what I had just played, but I also understood that no two playthroughs are going to be the same, and so, god damn, I was overcome with a need to know what other gamers had fucking dealt with while playing this brutal, layered, bizarre, confusing, and ultimately satisfying masterpiece. Nightmare Reaper has been in development for the better part of 5 years, and originally debuted in early access back in 2019. Developer Blazing Bit Games has thrown everything, including the kitchen sink, into the development of this game, a Herculean effort which the final product very clearly and proudly puts on display. I wasn't playing many games when this first launched back into early access, and by the time I decided to get serious with making content for this channel, the second of 3 episodes was made available to play. Well, that was fine, I thought. What I'll do is I'll just wait until the full release of the game, and then play through the whole thing all in one go, rather than plow through 2 out of 3 episodes and then have to wait for the last one. Sure, seemed like a good idea at the time, and while I'm very glad I waited, my full playthrough lasted me just over 26 hours, which if I'm remembering correctly tips the scale just a little bit over my playthrough for Head on Bloodright, making Nightmare Reaper the longest game I've played for this channel to date. And oh fuck kids, what a fucking game. First of all, I have to say in all sincerity, I repeat, do not fucking marathon this game. The temptation will be there, but god, just trust me, you're going to need to take breaks. You won't want to, but you need to. So watching this footage, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Nightmare Reaper is another solid-looking, action-packed, retro first-person shooter, much like all the others that I play. And on one hand, you'd be right in that assessment. But what if I told you Nightmare Reaper is not just a retro FPS? It's a retro FPS roguelike looter-shooter horror game with RPG elements. None of this is hyperbole. Nightmare Reaper is like 6 games in one. All of them have absurd levels of depth, and each of them ties into the other game modes. And as I got deeper into the game, I slowly realized it was absolutely necessary to play as much of these game modes as possible in order to progress as much as possible throughout the whole of the game. Something which you'll need to do in order to boost your character up to the point where they hope to even stand half of a rat's chance in hell going into the finale. But laying it all out on the table like that is probably seriously overwhelming and might even turn off some of you kids from playing this game. So, in order to make sense of it all as best as possible, we're going to break it down piece by piece, starting with the nightmare is where we'll be spending the bulk of the game. To start off, we play as a woman simply known as the Patient, who, when she sleeps, finds herself in this strange nightmare world where level by level she encounters increasingly deadly and terrifying enemies, who she dispatches by finding increasingly deadly and powerful weaponry. This is the roguelike looter-shooter bit of the game. Each level is procedurally generated, much like in Spelunky, so you won't see the same level twice in a row. Even if they all have specific elements the level must adhere to according to the design. The gist is simple. You start off with only one weapon, you rip and tear your way through the level collecting more weapons as you go, collect colored keys and solve environmental puzzles, and eventually make your way to the glowing blue portal at the end to move on to the next one. Each area of the nightmare is divided into 3 parts, and after completing each one, you'll then be introduced to a new biome with new enemies, weapons, all that good stuff. Now, even though the Patient is a death-dealing maelstrom in the nightmare, she is still only human, and if she takes too much damage and dies, she finds herself waking up in this is the horror segment of the game. See, the Patient is, in reality, or is it reality? locked inside of a mental hospital where she can investigate her surroundings. At first, the only place she can explore is her room, with no way out, despite being able to interact with the toilet and the sink, as well as the mysterious notes from what appears to be the doctor that is treating her. The doctor's notes tell the story of the patient and her background, dealing with some serious mental and emotional trauma stemming from childhood mistreatment. But as you clear through more and more of the nightmare, more and more of the hospital will slowly unlock, allowing the patient to walk around and discover areas that were previously off limits, which you might not even want to do because the hospital is seriously unnerving. But more on that later. Meanwhile, after unlocking a new room in the hospital, the patient discovers a second bed that she can lie down and sleep in, which doesn't take her to the nightmare, but instead takes her to... This is the horde mode aspect, and it's divided into a number of different arenas that the patient opens up over time whenever she finds one of these red symbols that float and pulse with malicious intentions. Hopping into the arena, the patient is tasked with surviving wave after wave of randomized enemies, and for every round she survives, she's gifted loads of jade coins, which are used to spend on the skill tree. We'll get there. The longer you survive, the more jade you collect, and the more deadly enemies will appear with each round. Just like in the nightmare, you start with whichever weapon you've chosen to hold on to, and can find more weapons throughout the arena to utilize in staying alive. But weapons aren't the only things that are going to keep the patient going. We're going to need to upgrade some stats along a very specific skill tree, which is done by playing... Pressing the escape button brings up the patient's Game Boy. How she has a Game Boy at a mental hospital is just kind of... You know what? Trying to make logic out of this isn't what we're here to do. Just roll with it. But the Game Boy has a platformer which looks, feels, and plays almost exactly like Mario 3, as if you couldn't tell. See, in the nightmare, the patient collects coins and treasure, which can then be spent here in the platformer. You have to spend a certain amount of gold to unlock a stage that the patient then hops through, and each stage will then grant the patient a specific upgrade, like being able to keep higher tier weapons at the end of a nightmare stage, or health boosts, stuff like that. But gold isn't the only currency the patient receives in the nightmare. At the end of each level, based on how many enemies were killed and treasure found, stuff like that, the patient is gifted topaz, which can then be spent in... This is where it starts to get a little weird. Now, you can access the platformer from the beginning of the game, but you'll have to track down the Monster Rancher title to play on the Game Boy as you search the nightmare. Once you've found it, there's an entire Pokemon-style, top-down RPG monster fighter game where you spend topaz to battle other monster trainers, and once you succeed, you are granted a stat boost. On top of that, you find pills here in the game.
Pills here!
Which can be equipped for stat bonuses while playing in the nightmare, like taking 20% less damage. And this then leaves the final Game Boy cartridge, the one where you can spend your jade coins. In the space shooter, you'll zip across galaxies in your little fighter ship, scanning parts of space to discover things like bonus jade, pirate raids, and space stations. Space stations are where you spend your jade and purchase significant upgrades like the ability to wall jump, become immune to lava, or even purchase a pet that will follow you around in the nightmare and attack enemies for you. The space shooter is probably the most tedious of the 3 Game Boy modes, as you'll find yourself warping through multiple zones, all of which require spending extra jade in order to be able to fly through them. So while this mode can and will give you some of the best stat boosts, it is a chore to navigate through sometimes, and honestly felt like the biggest distraction from the nightmare stages. But each of these modes are crucial to unlocking the patient's fullest potential. You're going to want to play through at least a little bit of the Monster Rancher and the Space Shooter to unlock stuff that will really help you out by the time you hit the end game. But the platformer is really the bread and butter of the skill trees. Each of these games is a fully formed game in and of itself, and there's so much content here that, unless you are incredibly diligent and willing to take your time, it is highly unlikely you will complete all of these modes on your first playthrough, which is fine, because Nightmare Reaper not only has a New Game Plus mode, it has a New Game Plus Plus, and a New Game Plus Plus Plus. God Christ, I am getting overwhelmed just thinking about this all over again. I'm glad I went in blind, because if I had known that there was this much to Nightmare Reaper, I might have been dreading it instead of being hyped to sit down and playing it. But that's the thing, kids. Even though there is so much here in the game to see and do and experience and overcome, 95% of it is arresting and investing, and it continually kept my interest in seeing where exactly this game was going to go next. Nightmare Reaper is a 100% immersive experience from the jump. There's no main menu that you start at to select a game. No, it immediately opens with a voice telling you to wake up, and you start in the nightmare with a brief tutorial on the basic controls. You're sent off to the races, and the first time you die, you're just now in the hospital, confused, thrown for a loop, unsure of what the fuck just happened. Now, of course, if you hit escape, you will have a menu pop up in the form of the Game Boy screen, which does little to clarify anything at all. So there is a menu, just not one that the game loads into. You're always starting by waking up in the hospital and either choosing to explore or to go to sleep and press through the nightmare. Okay, if all of this sounds interesting to any of you, then please just take my word for it and go fucking buy Nightmare Reaper right now and play the goddamn thing. I am highly recommending this, and I recommend going in as blind as possible so you can be surprised by some of the really cool shit that happens in it. Because starting right now, I'm gonna dig into the game in full and do my best to unpack this like a newlywed's U-Haul. The basic gameplay loop is pretty simple. Run through the levels of the nightmare, collecting gold and killing enemies and collecting treasure and finding secrets. Based on how much of that you accomplish, you're awarded bonuses, which you can spend in the skill tree games. And once a nightmare level is completed, you're bounced back to the hospital, where you can read the latest doctor's note to fill you in on story, and also see if there's anything new that has been unlocked for you to explore. At any time, whether in the nightmare or the hospital, you can bring up the Game Boy to access any of the skill tree games you've unlocked, play through them as much as you want, and go back to the main game when you want. The nightmare is the crux of the game and the only way to move your progress forward. I'd say about 85% of Nightmare Reaper is killing your way through nightmare levels. At first, they start out fairly straightforward. From the outset, the game's first chapter has the patient lay down to sleep and arrive in a level. There are 3 parts to each level, and once you've completed them all, you'll move on to the next one. Back to the Spelunky comparison. In that game, you'll arrive in the mines and have to go through 4 levels of the mines before you move on to the next level. The jungle, for example, and then have to go through 4 levels of that before moving on. Nightmare Reaper's first chapter is a linear progression just like that, featuring damp caves, haunted woods, an area filled with mushrooms, a village, a mine, more natural environments that slowly shift towards man-made environments. Chapter 2 switches up the formula by removing the linear one-by-one march of levels and drops the patient into a city-based hub where you can then wander around and find access to the next set of levels, but the order in which you go through them is up to you. We're also introduced to new mechanics such as a blue grappling hook, which is incredibly useful but won't work over water, as well as utilizing manholes to explore beneath maps in order to find secrets and access to alternate routes. The city hub will slowly open up new areas of the hub to explore, with new levels to access as you progress, such as an office building, a cemetery, a cargo ship, a prison, and eventually in the 3rd chapter we'll be introduced to multiple hubs, which each give access to new maps. But here the hubs themselves are levels where you'll be forced to fight your way through the hub, battling a variety of enemies until you find a new map to access. Then you play through the 3 levels on that map and return to the hub for a second round of battling enemies until you find the next access point, and then finally a 3rd round of the hub for the final access point, and then we're on to the next one. Here the environments become increasingly more fantastical. There's a battlefield, a moon base, a sorcerer's mansion, an empty void, an underwater area, and what is as close to hell as it gets around here. All in order to fight your way to the final boss and the final decision. Chapter 3 also gives us a brand new grappling hook, a red one, which can and will work over water, over empty voids, and can lead to some pretty sweet swinging and acrobatic moments. Overall, I really like the progression that the chapters present in the game, as they both represent and parallel the journey that the patient has undergone since the start of the game. We'll get to explaining that bit soon. As environments change and become more varied and weird, so too do enemies. Basic enemy types at the onset of the game are melee, ranged, and magical. Melee usually run around quickly and erratically to leap in close and slash at you in groups. Ranged usually carry either pistols or shotguns, with the shotgunners hitting harder but having a longer pause between shots. And magical enemies generally float around and toss magical attacks at you. There's also deformed monstrosities that don't really fall into any of the above categories, but will sometimes spawn smaller enemies or come at you in an attempt to do heavy damage while also tanking a lot of damage as well. Moving from chapter 1 to 2 to 3, see these enemy types evolve and become more dangerous and change shape over time to reflect the changing environments. Where the ranged enemies start off with pistols and machine guns, for example, by the end of the 3rd chapter they'll have new sci-fi forms and fire even more dangerous plasma rifles which hit harder and do so much more damage. Fucking Christ, they hurt. You might have an easier time in the beginning when the game is just lobbing enemies with exploding spores at you, but once you come across brain tanks that carry railguns, you will absolutely be questioning so many decisions. And the cowboys. The fucking cowboys. Fucking cowboys! You will always know the cowboys are around because you'll hear this. And then next thing you know, they're attacking you with double-barrel sawed-offs and sticks of dynamite. They move so fast, and they hit so hard. And every encounter with one is never just with one. There's always at least 2 hanging around. Oh, that fucking whistling haunts my dreams. But if we're going to plumb the depths of our nightmares and fuck around and find out, there'd better be an impressive arsenal attached to the ongoings, and thankfully Nightmare Reaper's collection of 80 some odd weapons absolutely slaps. I could attempt to list off a few of these weapons, but I would just have to make this video an extra half hour long at least, and I'm already doing a lot of talking, so let's just say that you've got the standard FPS classics, some interesting twists on the usual shit, and some really, really fucking weird stuff in here as well. A lot of these weapons are homages to other first-person shooters as well. In fact, a lot of this game features homages to other first-person shooters, but we're getting there, we're getting there. Now, weapons come in a couple different flavors. Since this has looter-shooter elements, we've got common, uncommon, rare, and legendary drops, as well as weapon levels, either 1, 2, or 3. The higher the rarity, the higher the chance that a weapon has a random statistic built into it, like having explosive ammo, or a higher critical damage percentage, or a stronger kickback. Sometimes they'll have elemental effects. Oftentimes, the rare and legendary weapons will have multiple stats built in, and these weapons really fuck. For example, I found a double-barreled shotgun that had explosive damage, fired a random projectile, and had a 40% chance to leech life from enemies and refill my health. And let me tell you, when I found it, that was my bread and butter for like 65% of the game. You're gonna find weapons all over the place, as random drops from enemies, in weapon containers, or at the end of puzzle rooms, which will usually give you higher rarity weapons. And when you get to the end of a map, you're given the chance to choose one of the weapons in your arsenal to keep and carry over to the next map. Now, at the beginning of the game, you can only choose a level 1 weapon to keep, but you can unlock the ability to keep level 2 weapons, and way later down the line, the ability to keep 2 weapons instead of just 1. Half the fun of the game is discovering and experimenting with all the different kinds of weapons, and the joy of finding something truly unique and super powerful to give you an edge in completing a map is fucking dynamite. Of course, you also have the potential to fuck it up, like I did. Sometimes while playing through the nightmare, random events will occur. One of them is a merchant who suspiciously looks like a doctor. Convenient. But sometimes he will offer to upgrade weapons to a higher rarity, buy your most used weapons for a large chunk of change, or allow you to re-roll a single stat on one of your weapons, which I did with my sawed-off, thinking that maybe I could get rid of the random projectile stat so my shotgun wouldn't shoot crystals anymore. But he just re-rolled it to random projectile again. So instead of shooting crystals, I started shooting large iron orbs that absolutely did no damage, and this filled the room and made it hard to see anything and made my shotgun completely useless. So I spent the next few levels scrambling around for something better, since I had no weapon to leech life from enemies and I'm dying left and right. I'm thinking I'm in trouble because I just fucked up my most useful weapon. But then I managed to pick up a demolitionist rifle, basically an M16 with a grenade launcher attachment, which had a 96% leech life chance. Oh.
Yeah, I'm thinking on back.
Outside the nightmare, however, things take a decidedly different turn. The hospital is one of the most hostile safe zones I have ever experienced in any game ever. Just listen to the ambient sounds. The further along in the game you get, the more the hospital seems to come to unholy life, with screams and sobbing and knocking and pounding and random light bulbs that shatter. As you progress through the nightmare, different parts of the hospital will unlock for you to explore, which allows you to find red shards to unlock new arena maps. But it also teases and hints at something else going on within the hospital walls. The only way to unlock one of the lower level doors is to activate the fire alarm, which changes all the lights in the building to red and emits a creepy beeping sound from above that, no matter how many times I did it, was the creepiest goddamn thing. While you're never in danger directly moving through the hospital, you'll also never feel completely safe either. The patient's shadow sometimes lurks around corners, waiting to rush you or just disappear, and sometimes the shadow will be sitting in the middle of the floor, sobbing. Each time the patient returns to her room after a map, there will be different scribbles on the walls, or furniture moved around, or blood on the mirror. It all perfectly captures a sense of unease and dismay throughout the course of the game, which is fitting because now we need to talk about I'm gonna try to not spoil too much in this section, but holy shit. So for the most part, the game's story is all show, no tell, as the progression through the nightmare and the platformer give the player a general sense of what is kind of going on. Because in both of those game modes, we have the patient moving through what is ostensibly a fairly familiar environment and progressing towards more dangerous, more hazardous, and more twisted locations. Now, when we couple this presentation with the information from the doctor's notes that we read at the end of each nightmare level, a very subtle but also super disturbing picture begins to form. See, the doctor details some of the incredibly harrowing childhood abuse the patient suffered at the hands of her parents while growing up, but in doing so also details the patient's coping mechanisms, which consisted of playing old video games and watching old movies her parents probably stole to resell for drug money. And by diving into these fictional worlds, the patient was able to detach herself from an abusive environment, which then plays out in both the nightmare and the platformer. Because you see, all the Easter eggs and references to other games and movies, even in the achievements, make sense intentionally, because the patient is building these worlds in her psyche as barriers against the real world, casting herself as a ruthless warrior armed to the teeth with basically any and every weapon she's ever seen in anything, mowing down hordes of what are essentially her own personal demons just to cope. So as the environments become more and more fantastical, and as the encounters become more and more harried and the stakes are raised even further, they, by necessity, need to be so in order to help deal with the deeper, more aggressive traumas that lie within her mind. It's brilliant storytelling done in the simplest manner, utilizing show don't tell to its fullest. And even once the doctor's notes make certain aspects of the story more overt, it doesn't take away from the work being done by simply playing the game, nor does it even provide full answers. There are several aspects of the game which are still up in the air and never fully explained, nor should they, because it adds to the fun of trying to figure out what the hell is actually going on with all of this. I love it when games trust a player to put all the pieces together. Last year, Vomitorium told a deep, layered narrative using minimalism and visual cues to lead players through an effective story. And this year, it's Nightmare Reaper, serving one of the most effective and downright best narratives that I have ever had the pleasure of playing through in a first-person shooter. Meanwhile, graphically, this game is gorgeous. Gorgeous! You've been watching this shit the entire time, and you can see this. Lighting effects, texture mapping. How the fuck did they make these crunchy wall textures look like bump mapping? I am shook. Nightmare Reaper's art style shies away from being realistic and instead adopts a far more retro stylized aesthetic in both character design and in environmental design. But all of this is couched in some very modern graphical effects such as lighting and shadows. I think this is the first game where I really didn't mind at all that bloom was on. I didn't even realize it was on until I went back over footage and spied the bloom setting while I was adjusting graphics. The bloom reflections on the water are just fucking killer. This game is ridiculously pretty to look at. And that said, there were a few minor performance issues that popped up here and there. Nothing overly crazy, but sometimes when leaping out of bounds in levels where leaping out of bounds was almost a requirement, I could see through walls and sort of cheese my navigation. But for the most part, the only real performance issue I encountered was that the game would stutter on occasion. No frame rate drops or anything serious, but sometimes the game would stop for a second as though calculating way too many things all at once and then resume gameplay. These instances were few and far between, but happened enough throughout the course of the 26 hours I put into the game that it was something I came to expect to happen sometimes. And largely, it didn't happen at inconvenient times, but once or twice I'd be in the middle of a fraught combat, and then it would hitch and I'd think, oh god, now I'm gonna die. But again, fortunately, it was just a quick stutter, noticeable enough to be noticeable, and then we moved on. Graphically speaking, Nightmare Reaper puts in the work to not only make the environments full and rich, but also dreamlike. From the lighting effects to the texture work, whether in the nightmare or the hospital, every environment felt just a little off, a little too unreal, a little too familiar, helping to craft a deep sense of unease no matter where I was, because nothing ever felt solid or trustworthy, but like places where I had been somewhere once already and almost knew not to trust it. Meanwhile, the score. Oh, the score! Andrew Hulshult has quickly become my new favorite game composer, which almost feels like hyperbole, but let's be real. With each new soundtrack and each new game Hulshult has worked on, his compositions constantly enter my musical rotation, and next thing you know, I'm hip deep in his discography again, listening to Proteus and A Medieval and Dusk. With Nightmare Reaper, I was caught off guard at first because the soundtrack is probably his most straightforward metal soundtrack so far. You know, I've grown accustomed to his use of synth and other electronic instruments, but there's very little of that here in Nightmare Reaper, if any at all. This is all driving, thunderous guitar work and bass lines and drum beats. And at first, I have to admit that it turned me off a little bit. I think I'm so used to hearing generic synth metal and indie first-person shooters that Hulschultz's compositions here kind of sounded like those generic metal scores, and I was disappointed. It doesn't help that in the beginning stages of the game, the combat tracks will fade in the moment you start shooting at anything, but you won't have very many enemies to combat at first, so you'll shoot at something, kill it, the battle music will keep going for a moment, and then it'll fade out. It wasn't till near the middle of the first chapter that the tracks started to click for me. I pulled up the soundtrack on Spotify and gave it a listen, and oh baby, did it really sink in. These tunes are some of Hulschultz's best work. Driving, destructive, devilishly good shit that pumps up the action and also enhances the underlying story of a woman on a rampage through her own psyche. Because yeah, this sounds exactly like what would be playing through someone's head in such a situation. I especially loved it when the choral sections would start playing, which added a thoroughly unironic epic feel to it all. Here, have a little listen. Ah, yeah, that's the stuff. There's so much more that I could detail, but this is a big enough review as it is. Nightmare Reaper is a stunning achievement. Strictly from a gameplay perspective, it is easily the best game I have played so far this year. Add in the graphics, the storytelling, the soundtrack, and the sound design, and Nightmare Reaper stands tall as an easy contender for Game of the Year. While there are a few missteps along the way, they are so few and so minor that they hardly detract from the overall experience. Minor performance issues aside, the Monster Rancher and Space Shooter skill trees felt bigger and more unnecessary than I think they really needed to be. I was fine with the platformer, but those two extra retro game modes probably could have been left on the cutting room floor, and Nightmare Reaper wouldn't be lesser for it. There is, however, an option in the game menu to turn off the retro games and ignore them, but I don't think that's necessary either. After all, you get some of the best skills and upgrades from playing the Space Shooter, so it is a bit of a necessity to play through it a bit. But when you combine this with Nightmare Reaper's multiple New Game Plus modes, there's less pressure to stop, drop, and dive into the other retro cartridges and play them all the way through for upgrades, because you'll be able to get what you need, beat the game, and then go back in and play through each mode in New Game Plus if you so desire. I am exhausted, drained, thoroughly worn out, and also so very, very ready to jump back in and play this all the way through all over again. Because you see, Nightmare Reaper has two different endings. While they probably aren't incredibly different as to how they play out, the notion of choice there is very interesting. And after everything I've been through this first time, I'm ready to go back and choose the road less traveled and see what I missed. Combine that with the best damn final boss fight, and by best, I mean an adrenaline-soaked nightmare that was every bit what Doom Eternal's Dark Lord should have been. Nightmare Reaper lands at a very solid 9.5 out of 10, and this is an absolute must-play for fans of the genre. Whew. Kids, I had no idea this game was going to be this big or take this long to produce a review for, so yeah, sorry this one took me so long to get out the door. And also, if you'd like early access to any and all of my content and feel like supporting me in making these videos, please consider joining my Patreon. The link is in the description below, and I'm always very grateful and thankful for those of you who do so. Alright kids, it's late, you've got homework, and I need a cigarette after all this chaos. Brush your teeth real well, remember to pack a lunch, and fill up your water bottle so you can stay hydrated. And stay safe, kids. I'll see you next time.